I read a great book over the summer. It was called Paranoid Parenting by Frank Furedi. Frank Furedi is a professor of sociology at the University of Kent. I enjoyed it, I got lots of good insights in, and he said some things that I'd thought, I'm not sure I'd heard anyone else say them before. It's always reassuring when someone else seems to think similar things to yourself as well. And his basic theme is he is attacking the idea of parenthood experts. And he's saying the parents are much better left to their own devices to work on their instincts and their common sense rather than listening to the professional advice that's floating around them. So what I want to do is look through the book. I'm going to read some excerpts from it and just add a few thoughts on my own. So let's see what he's got to say. Every possible form of interaction between an adult and a child is perceived as yet another opportunity for child abuse. In a roundabout way, 21st century Britain has normalised paedophilia. I think that's true. It's talked about so much. Children hear so much about it. It's at the forefront of so many people's minds that when you see an adult and a child, or an adult looks at a child, or a child looks at an adult, not far away is the question, is there some sort of abuse going on? Is something wrong going on? And it's really unhealthy when you create that situation, that that's one of the first things that comes to mind when you think about an adult and a child being together. So I think to an extent, certainly child abuse has been normalised in adults' minds and in children's minds, and I think that undermines the relationship between adults and children. Government initiatives are based on the premise that they both have the right and authority to manage the behaviour of parents. Now, there's no news there in Scotland, because the Scottish government is very keen on managing the behaviour of parents. People think of the named person scheme, the smacking ban. There's a whole host of other areas as well where they've got the true parenting wisdom and they want to support parents in putting that into practice. From time to time, government officials react defensively when criticised for overstepping their jurisdiction. They certainly do. Their usual reaction is to assert that what they're doing is not to promote the nanny state, but to help or support the targets of its intervention. However, with the passing of time, advocates of state intervention into private life have become more aggressive in justifying their right to manage people's behaviour. Help or support, you hear that from the Scottish government. With the smacking ban, we're not trying to tell parents how to bring up their kids, we're just trying to support them, to help them to do it in the best way, for the benefit of the kids. So when you hear the words support, often a good translation is coerce into doing it our way. It really should come as no surprise that some children have begun to play off this general distrust of adults to make life difficult for those they don't like. Most children are enterprising creatures for whom adult insecurities provide an opportunity to exercise their power. Every year, hundreds of teachers face false allegations of abuse. A teacher wept openly at the April 2000 conference of the Association of Teachers and Lecturers as he recounted his 3 months of agony after being falsely accused of punching a 12-year-old pupil. Other teachers recounted cases of false accusation and demanded that school staff should not be treated as guilty until proven innocent. That's a really important point. The normal procedure, if any sort of accusation of child abuse is made, a teacher is instantly suspended from their job. Allegedly, they say it's without prejudice, so no one's supposed to read anything into it. But really, what an embarrassment, what damage to your reputation, what stress, etc. that causes. And that can be caused by just a little troublemaker sticking an anonymous note under the headmaster's door, say. And that's the risk teachers run. It's tempting to blame malicious children for making life hell for some of their teachers, but it's not really their fault. They're merely manipulating a dirty-minded world created by obsessive adults. Again, I think that's right. They hear so much about child abuse, and they know the staff are vulnerable. They know they're a bit afraid, so the children know they've got a bit of power and a bit of leverage should they want to use it. I think that balance needs to be redressed. Research surveys indicate that people now live farther away from relatives. Many of us barely know our neighbours and show little interest in their affairs. This indifference underlines the absence of communal affinity. Now that's something we've looked at as the Scottish Family Party. There is a trend for families to live in different parts of the country, different countries, more and more. And there's some ways in which that's obviously not helpful for family life. So we want to look at ways of enabling families to stay within easy travelling distance of each other. We're going to see what policies we can have to help with that. Okay, jumping around with this, what else have we got? Right, this is talking about the way parents feel because of the sort of expert advice that's floating around. They're intimidated because failure to love on a child's terms is condemned as an act of parental malevolence. Many parents do succeed in withering their children's love, writes Dorothy Rowe, ominously. Rowe seems to divide the world of parents into two types. Those who love and those who try to control their children through fear. And you can hear that way of thinking coming through in Scottish Government thinking. You can coming through in educational thinking. There's basically two ways of dealing with children. There's the loving way, which just involves pure love. There's the loving way, and then as an alternative to that, there's the way that might involve being a bit stern or punishments or whatever. And the idea is that these are two different ends of a spectrum, and every parent is somewhere on that spectrum. And obviously the best place to be is at the extreme far left, where there's no room for any sternness or punishment or anything like that. Completely unbalanced view, but it does make parents feel guilty. It makes them feel guilty about putting their foot down and punishing, holding the line, whatever, with their own kids. Children who are provided with attention on demand have little incentive to confront problems on their own. Very true. The advice is often that if a child needs something, you've got to be there in a minute. In a second, you've got to be addressing their needs, being with them, supporting them, helping them through whatever little problem they've got. Children can become addicted to parental attention. Youngsters who are trained to believe that parental attention and love on demand is their birthright are likely to find it difficult to cope with circumstances where they're not the focal point of everyone's attention. Again, that's very true. I used to find when I was teaching, sometimes, particularly as a housemaster, a boy might come along and he's got something he wants to ask or whatever. Sometimes I'd say, I'm just busy at the moment, I'm just talking to someone else, just come back in a minute. And you can see sometimes this is though, you know, what is going on? They've never experienced that before. The fact that someone's not going to address their need absolutely immediately. But that's an important part of growing up. And adults and parents in particular are made to feel guilty for not attending to their child's needs absolutely instantaneously, whereas actually that's for their own good and their development. Children of authoritarian parents often acknowledge that they are certain that their fathers and mothers love them. And some children whose parents overdose them with non-stop attention indicate that they are ambivalent about their parents' attitude to them. So the author's referring here to some evidence. Actually, the more straight down the line parents, or authoritarian as they call it here, actually the children often felt more secure than some children whose parents had a more laissez-faire approach, clearly the reverse of what the theory would seem to predict. This is interesting. So not so long ago, it was sufficient to send kids to school clean, rested, well-fed and well-clothed. Teachers assumed that they would do their job and parents would do theirs. Today, in a desperate attempt to improve standards of education, parents concerned for their children is manipulated to draw them in as unpaid teachers. I think that's very true. When I was at primary school or school, there was no idea that you gave work that your mum or dad had to do with you at home. When my sons were at primary school, that was quite common. You're always getting things to do with them. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. Maybe there's a case for trying to deal with all the straightforward educational things at school, then leaving home time for different things. But of course the trend is to blur the margin. A lot of the things that they do at school are things that would actually be better off left to be dealt with at home. Whereas there's not time to do all the academic education in school, so the schools are hoping the parents will do it after school. Until recently, most Western societies were subject to cultural influences that represented family life in glowing terms as the institution through which self-realization took place, an honoring of family life, so that young people look at it as something to aim for. It's a very noble ambition, a route to fulfillment. Do many young people think like that? And a lot of them tend not to, because that's not the message that's presented to them. It's partly because of the influence of sort of feminist activism in education. They want to give the message, particularly to girls, that career is what it's all about. You need to get a good job and get up the career ladder. That is success. That is fulfilling your potential. And things apart from that, well, they can be an impediment to that. So I think that's a good point. That's something we would want to restore, would be the value of family life. There are some people, by the way, some academics, who think that parents should be licensed. So like you have to have a license to own a dog, you'd have to have a license to have kids or to look after kids. That's a pretty scary thought. Obviously, it's not the paying a bit of money and getting a piece of paper from the post office that's the problem. It's the conditions they attach. Obviously, as soon as it's licensed by the government, they'll have more and more control of it. Now, there's no sign of that happening in Scotland, apart from, of course, for fostering and adopting. When you look at fostering and adopting, you see the standards the government would like to impose on everyone that looks after children. Same for teaching as well. So they would like to impose those standards. They think they're the minimum standards for someone to be suitable to look after children. So we can assume they would like to impose the same standards on parents, but they don't actually feel they could do that yet. I haven't heard any suggestion that's going to happen, but maybe give it 10 years, who knows, that could be on the cards. Right, it's an interesting passage. Since the 1960s, glorification of youth culture, since the 1960s glorification of youth culture, many parents have felt uncomfortable with their role as responsible adults. Today, it's common for adults to cling to a youthful identity, insist that they still have a lot more grown up to do, and shamelessly copy the fashions of the younger generation. For some time now, parents, teachers, and other adults involved with children have gone out of their way to cross the generational divide and become the young people's friends rather than their mentors. This changing perception of adulthood, an unconscious process of infantilization, both reflects and reinforces the weakening of adult authority. Uncertainties about adulthood are invariably linked to changing ideas about childhood. Adults who sometimes behave like children are just as likely to treat children as adults. Maturity is disparaged as being past it, and older generations are seen as having no special claim to wisdom. The corollary has been the promotion of the concepts of children's rights and autonomy. As a result, many mothers and fathers find it difficult to act decisively with their children. The depreciation of adulthood. In a world where a parent's word is not law, a sense of powerlessness and the fear of losing control haunts most parents. Mothers and fathers often react by doing whatever they can to make home life as attractive as possible. Since the 1930s, child experts have encouraged parents to adopt a more open and playful relationship with their children. Historians of family life have noted the crucial role played by the caring professions in convincing parents to abandon their old-fashioned authoritarian ways for a more fun-loving, interactive style. Lisa Jacobson's study of the modernization of the American home points out that child experts urged parents to adapt his language of salesmanship, persuasion, and enticement, and to forsake harsh discipline for understanding companionship. These new authorities insisted that the ideal father should be a friend and enjoyable companion rather than a policeman. A new conception of middle-class motherhood and fatherhood emerged, based on the belief that parental authority was most effectively exercised through play and friendship rather than obedience and discipline. And that's absolutely true. The emphasis has been on being the children's friends, being alongside them, rather than taking a step back and exerting some sort of authority. The author goes on to say, sometimes fathers and mothers have to adopt a policing role and demand the unquestioned obedience of their child. It's certainly true. Parents complain that their authority is continually weakened by outside pressures. They say that it's difficult to make their children toe the line when the rest of the world encourages lax behavior. Children can tap into this uncertainty and manipulate it. Children are good at finding contradictions between their parents' instructions and the standards of behaviour endorsed by other adults. They complain that their friends are not subjected to such unreasonable demands as having to be home by supper time. Of course, parents sometimes find it easy to blame others for their failure to get their child to comply. But it's true that mothers and fathers receive virtually no public support or encouragement in the exercise of parental authority. Instead of reassuring us that holding the line serves children's best interest, contemporary culture signals that parental authority should be viewed with suspicion. For example, discipline is often presented as harsh, authoritarian, and sometimes a form of abuse. Everywhere we look, parents appear in an unattractive light. Popular culture portrays parents as out-of-touch deadbeats who are insensitive to their children's needs. In contrast, children are represented as essentially smart, streetwise, and resourceful. In particular, parents who try to discipline their children are treated as objects of derision. This depreciation of adulthood and the elevation of the child are strikingly conveyed through television and popular films. Children are regularly featured as morally superior to grown-ups, while their parents and other adults depicted as craven fools. You see this sort of quasi-worship of childhood in the Scottish Parliament when they invite children in and ask them to take part in the debates. We're talking about 7 and 8-year-olds. And when the 7 or 8-year-old says something which is, to be honest, shows that they don't really understand what's going on, the politicians reply as if it's the most profound thing they've ever heard. And the reason they do that is partly they're just trying to be nice, but it's also that they think that's morally good. I think it's somehow virtuous to elevate children and to deprecate adults. It's the Greta Thunberg syndrome, but it's much more widespread than that. Okay, let's carry on. The depreciation of childhood coincides with the the depreciation of adulthood coincides with the idealization of childhood and childishness, positing adults as morally inferior. In a secular variant of the religious theme of humanity's fall from grace, innocent children are said to be ruined by toxic parents in a toxic society. Campaigners promoting the idea of stranger danger contribute to a climate where the stranger, that is, the vast majority of adults inhabiting this planet, is not worthy of the child's trust. There are some children's rights activists who talk about the right of children to divorce their parents. So if they decide they're not really happy with the service offered by the parents they've got, they could go along to social services, I assume, and say they'd like some new ones. That would be a sort of universal right for any child who fancied a change. Anyway, mind you, I sort of dismissed that lightly. Don't forget the things that are just on the wacky fringe at one point. In 3 years' time, 5 years' time, you could find that's government policy. But anyway, children these days seem to be victims of a split personality syndrome. On one hand, they're depicted as vulnerable creatures in need of constant supervision. That's another big theme in the book, the vulnerability of children, the idea that they're so delicate, particularly emotionally delicate, that they need all sorts of support and protection from just everyday interactions. But on the other hand, they're often represented as competent to make informed and responsible choices about their lives. Today, adults are advised to consent and negotiate rather than to act or make decisions on their children's behalf. These widespread sentiments are codified in the doctrine of children's rights. According to its proponents, children have the right to participate in making decisions that influence their lives. Now, in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it does talk about children having the right to have a say in decisions that affect them. But it's obviously talking about, if you look at the text, it's clearly talking about things like which parent you're going to live with. That's the sort of thing. But it gets translated into particularly in the school context, that you can't tell children what to do. You've always got to negotiate. You can't say, today we're learning about trigonometry. It's on page 10. You've always got to discuss what's going to be the way forward. So schools don't have rules at all, but they might have sort of guidelines, but those guidelines have to be arrived at in discussion with the pupils. It's not really in discussion, it's just a facade really, but that's the sort of smoke screen that they operate behind. Now, it's talking here about another sort of extreme children's rights activist. He believes that children's interests cannot be represented adequately by the parents in elections, and therefore the voting age should be reduced to 16, while those who are younger than 16 should have a vote administered by their mothers, presumably at the child's diktat. Now, the idea of children voting, so I've heard people advocating For that, some people say children should be able to vote as soon as they can understand what it is and make the decision to go along to vote. I mean, how open is that to parental pressure and influence? But voting at 16, well, in Scotland we've got it. We've got it. 16 so far, but by the logic of the Scottish government, it will go down before too long. Generally, they tend to think that 12 is the age when they can make decisions. So whether or not they're going to have sex change surgery or some other crucial medical procedure, age 12 is when children are thought to be able to make their own decisions. So if you make a decision about that, you're not making a decision about voting, you would think so to be consistent. So watch this space. The voting age, I would imagine, would go down further. It will be the Greens who will be arguing for it first of all. Watch this space. Parenting manuals continually contract the parent's needs with the child's needs. Parenting professionals often adopt the posture of umpire or mediator. And you can see that. You can imagine the situation where a child wants one thing, mum and dad are saying, no, you're not going to have that. So then the child goes to the professionals to name person or to other experts, other professionals, other state agents. And then they see their function is to go into the family and solve the problem. Not to back up the parents, not to deal with a disobedient child or an overly demanding child, but to solve the problem, to reach a compromise. So you can just imagine them sitting everyone down in the room and hearing everyone's point of view and then trying to arrive at some sort of middle ground, thereby just destroying the parents' authority. But that's the way other people, professionals in Scotland, think you support families. The caring professions thrive on alleged conflicts of interest between members of a family. Such conflicts justify their existence and provide them with plenty of work. The conflict-oriented model of family life makes professionals indispensable to the resolution of parenting problems. Very definitely in Scotland there is a huge professional class, parenting experts, child rearing experts, who are seeing problems, making problems, not just individual cases, but more broadly as well in the way parents act towards their children. And they see themselves as the solution to it, thereby keeping the government funding flowing in their direction. One of the ironies of the present era is that while politicians complain that parents don't control their children, powerful voices also decry the exercise of strong parental authority. That's so true. The message from the government: make sure your children eat healthily, lots of vegetables, fruit and vegetables, they need to be out being active, not too long on screens, all this sort of thing. But those sort of things can often be a bit of a battle with children. So what means do the government think parents are going to use to ensure the children behave in these ways? Well, any means they do use, the government frowns on it. It thinks they shouldn't really have to resort to that. Which is a major contradiction. Many parents report that the struggle to gain their child's compliance is a 24-hour-a-day struggle. Most of us find it difficult to simply say no. Parents spend an inordinate amount of time weighing up different options. Should I make an issue out of this now, or wait until we're alone? Should I pretend not to notice that she's ignored me yet again, or come down on her firmly? Child caretakers agonize over every reprimand they issue, and often go on to relive the experience. Should I have used different words? Should I have waited until I was less angry? Routine anxieties about everyday discipline issues are reinforced by more intense apprehensions about losing control altogether. But that's what people soak up in our society, that you're very prone to damage children by the way you speak to them, or the way that you draw boundaries, tell them they can't do things, whatever. And it makes parents timid, it makes them worried that they're not quite doing it right. Whereas if they were left to it, their instinct would be to parent naturally and to tell the kids what to do when that's necessary and to expect them to do it. But there's so many messages that undermine that natural confidence that parents have. Parenting manuals often provide a bag of tricks for anxious parents and hints that the compliance of children can be gained through clever psychological maneuvers. Now, I've heard that. You hear it in education, you see it in different contexts where children are looked after. The idea, if you just know the right trick, then you can sort of fool them into behaving. There are various techniques that you can use. Well, one problem with that is that there are not. They're ultimately not going to work. You're going to come across children, or all children at some point at the most awkward, are not going to respond to those techniques. And once they realize that there's nothing backing it up, then you're in trouble from then on. And the other reason is it just comes across as weak, because basically if you're trying to do a deal with them, if you're doing these psychological tricks, they often basically amount to the fact that you're trying to bribe the kids. You're offering something in return for them being obedient. And if they realize that that's the game, well, you're going to have problems on an ongoing basis, because every time there's a situation where a kid thinks, Mum wants me to do that, if I just drag my heels a bit, what will she offer me? And you can see that's a sort of helpful strategy. Anyway, parenting manuals counsel us to be firm, to be consistent, and to draw boundaries for our child. Unfortunately, such good advice is linked to disciplinary techniques that evade the question of punishing negative behavior. Disciplinary techniques based on reasoning, positive reinforcements, and negotiation can play a useful role in managing a child's behavior, but such techniques are unlikely to be effective in all circumstances, and other more assertive methods are sometimes required to discourage a child from negative behavior. I've thought that so often when you watch these TV shows or read something in magazines. It will say you have to be very firm, you have to set your boundaries and stick to them, you've got to be absolutely consistent. That's the advice, parents. But then you look at what happens when these boundaries are crossed. It's so feeble, in some cases virtually non-existent, it completely undermines this apparently firm message that they start off with. A part of the problem is it's encouraging methods that are ineffective. But the other thing is it's undermining the parents' confidence as well, because it's telling them to be firm, but then it tells them that being firm involves, sending someone to the naughty step for 1 minute as an absolute last resort. So the parents think, oh well, if that's being firm, well, it just recalibrates their scale of responses and moves them more in a timid and sort of lax direction. In an ideal world, parental authority would be discharged through the power of reason. In the real world, matters are quite different. Any mother or father who is prepared to renounce entirely the use of punishment also risks having to abandon the claim to parental authority. Let's just translate that into the teaching context, as is happening in Scottish schools. Any teacher or school who is prepared to renounce entirely the use of punishment also risks having to abandon the claim to authority. Anyway, parents recognise they need a wide range of sanctions to carry out their role, which is why we continue, albeit reluctantly, to punish disobedient children. This intuitive response to circumstances now faces a challenge from influential voices in the parenting industry, and in Scotland and in the educational industry as well. A discussion over a troublesome episode may teach a child very little unless the child understands that it has important consequences. Now that links into the restorative approach, beloved, of Scottish schools, where every type of misbehaviour is ideally dealt with by just talking it through and helping the child to realise the error of its ways. The child often just thinks it's a bit of a joke, it's weak, and at the end of it they think, oh, nothing happened, and all the other kids think nothing happened, so just carry on and do the same thing again. Now, another thing that these parenting experts say, they give the assurance that a child's naughty behaviour is quite normal, and that encourages parents to evade the issue of how to curb normal but antisocial behaviour. And I've heard that lots of times. Kid is having a tantrum because he can't get his own way. Someone say, oh, it's just normal. Well, they know it's normal, but it's also normal for parents to get a grip and teach the child that they're not going to put up with that. Then the child learns that you can't grow through life throwing tantrums every time you don't get your own way. You see this in the sex education materials as well. There's one I was watching the other day, and it was saying watching pornography is completely normal. What does that mean? It implies that it puts it in some sort of favourable light. So if someone was saying in a school, bullying is perfectly normal, happens in every school, loads of kids do it, it's just completely normal. You'd think, hang on a minute, that's completely complacent. That's not the message. What you mean is bullying is common, but it's something that's not right, it's something we need to deal with. If you just say something is normal, you're implying that it's not a problem. It's something that should be left alone. Children's disobedient behaviour is rendered acceptable not only through the "it's just a stage" argument, but also by the tendency to treat misbehaviour as a medical condition. In recent years, we've witnessed the discovery of a variety of hidden syndromes that are reported to afflict children. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is only the most recent childhood syndrome to be highlighted in the media. ADHD is characterized by many of the traits that would, in the absence of a medical definition, be frowned upon as bad behavior: inability to concentrate, lack of application, or unruliness. For some parents, it seems, the discovery of a new childhood disorder provides a welcome explanation for their parents' bad behavior or poor performance at school. She isn't naughty, she's ill. Now, I think I might have overstated that slightly there, but there certainly is a case. When I was teaching, you'd have cases where you'd have a boy that would, say, never turn up with his books, or it just wouldn't get on with his work in class or whatever. There's some sort of issue. So he'd be sent to an educational psychologist. Then the psychologist would ask the school for a report on him. So I would be asked to contribute to the report. So I would say what he's like. He won't do any work in class and he never brings his books, or whatever. And then you get the report back from the psychologist, and the report says he doesn't do any work in class and he always doesn't bring his books. Okay, we knew that. But now it's in a psychologist's report, so it's changed status. It's now a diagnosis. So he's effectively got "do no work in class and don't bring your books" syndrome. So from that point onwards, if I were to criticize him in a report and say he needs to get his act together and bring his books, or heaven forbid, punish for one of those things, that would be entirely out of order, because it's on his statement from the psychologist. So you've just got to accept that from then on, and that's the way it can work. Now, I was talking again here against the general disapproval of punishment, or opposition to the very philosophy of punishment, and the way that they use smacking as there's a wedge issue for that. It makes better PR to confine hostility to punishment to the easy and evocative target of smacking. Smacking serves as a symbol for a campaign that believes that the exercise of parental authority is potentially damaging to children. I was going on to other phrases, ways of looking at things that encourage parents to just put up or to ignore bad behavior. Pick your battles. It's only a stage. It's your problem, not your child's. Your child's defiance is only a call for attention. It's better to ignore bad behavior than to reward it with attention. Compromise. Communicate your feelings. Most advice these days provides a ready-made excuse for not holding the line and for avoiding the exercise of parental authority. That's one you hear quite a lot, isn't it? It's just attention seeking. Like when a child is going, I've seen this with parents, a child is going berserk, smashing the place up, behaving appallingly, being incredibly rude and aggressive, and they say, "No, I'm not rewarding it with attention. I'm a tough parent, I just ignore it." Hang on a minute. When you get older, that sort of behavior is not going to be ignored. People are going to have a major problem with it, and there's going to be serious consequences if you do that. So the ideal thing for children is to learn at the earliest possible stage. That doesn't work. Whereas if you think it's an attention-seeking ploy and just ignore it, that's not helpful. The notion that family advice was inherently flawed was the invention of a new group of professional experts that emerged at the start of the 20th century. They claimed that parenting was a science that was too important to be left to ignorant mothers and fathers. Although parents had managed to bring up children for tens of thousands of years without the help of experts, professionals claimed that their science would provide a far more enlightened and effective approach to child rearing. And you can see this quite explicitly in some of the materials. Remember the thing from the Scottish government saying about, like grannies trying to poison you with an unhealthy food. The idea that current parents need to get the wisdom from the state. The last thing we want current parents to be doing is to be following the style of parenting of their parents or their grandparents, because that's obviously completely wrong, because that's different from the SNP's idea of things. So we want people to put that aside and to focus entirely on the government's wisdom. Whenever any child rearing problem is under scrutiny, it's invariably treated as a hangover from the bad habits of previous generations. Opponents of corporal punishment advance a standard argument that parents hit their children because their parents hit them. Why do we smack at all? Asks the feature in parenting. It makes sense to smack because we've seen the generation before us do so, when smacking was considered acceptable. Unacceptable behaviour towards children is routinely attributed to copying one's parents. The argument is rarely extended in the positive forms of behaviour. This is good. We don't ask the question, why do we love our children, in order to invite the answer, because we've seen our parents smother us with love. Positive parenting is usually attributed to effect of our enlightened society, while negative parenting is blamed on the poor nurturing of our own parents. Very true. Self-esteem, we talk about self-esteem, which has maybe gone out of fashion a little bit, but it's still seen to some extent as the panacea for all child rearing problems. If we just boost self-esteem, everything will be fine. It's interesting hearing that even in academic subjects. Like if someone's doing maths, a lot of people, they will talk about their maths ability always in terms of confidence. Okay, so if they can't do it, they're not very good at it, the problem is they need more confidence. And if they can do it, that's because they are confident. As though this emotion is the key thing, where it's not. I mean, the ability to do it is a combination of brain power and having been taught, having learnt it properly, which leads to confidence. But for a lot of people, it's seen that this emotion of confidence is actually at the front of the train and everything else follows on behind it. It's not quite that simple, to say the least. Anyway, self-esteem was promoted as an all-purpose solution to virtually every childhood problem. I remember seeing something, it always used to be, oh no, why do some children act as bullies? It's because they've got low self-esteem, and it's the only way they've got a boost in their self-esteem. But some research has shown that bullies actually have higher self-esteem, and that would certainly be my experience as well. The real bullies, the ones who are cocksure and extremely confident in themselves. But for a long time, still to an extent today, self-esteem is seen as the universal panacea. Okay, and since the experts know so little about so many of their claims, we might as well ignore them and act on our instincts. Parents usually know better than anyone else what's the best way to bring up their children. What is referring to here is all the allegedly scientific evidence that supports one expert or another expert's claim. When people try and reproduce the experiments, reproduce the research, they often find they just don't get the same results. It doesn't work. And often you've got contradictory results as well floating around in the body of research. So you've got one expert writing the book, they'll take a set of research and write their book on it saying this is what scientists have found, this is the way you have to do it. Then there'll be an equally valid set of evidence pointing in completely the opposite direction. So as Frank suggests, there's a pretty good case for ignoring the lot and going by your instincts. Objective research requires that others replicate its findings. The history of research into parenting is characterized by non-replicated results. So someone does some research, writes a book about it, becomes a famous parent expert, someone else tries to do the same experiment, doesn't work. They don't get the same results. But for the first bloke, who cares? He's sold all his books, he's been on all the breakfast TV shows and all the magazines, and he's influenced millions of parents, so he's not too bothered. It also talks about advocacy research that doesn't set out to discover what's not known, seeks to influence public opinion. I mean, it's a well-known fact that in academia in general, there's a huge bias among the academic staff towards a left, liberal, progressive perspective. In a department such as sociology, it's not far off total, wall-to-wall, to progressive, liberal, left-wing viewpoint. So when they come to do research, what are they looking for? What are they trying to back up? And they get the answers that they want. I'm not saying they actually make up the numbers and cheat in that way, but if research doesn't quite give them the results that they wanted, what happens to that research? Well, it sort of goes in the bin. If you get something that really backs up the point you're trying to make publicly, then that will get published in a journal. Even the way you frame the questions can have a huge influence. And when you've got the data as well, there's so many ways of analysing data that you can often get the result that you want. I heard once the phrase, if you torture the data for long enough, it'll give you the answer that you want. And I think that's what happens with a lot of sociological research. The term support is often a euphemism for prescriptive advice. And Mary Todd, the children's minister in Scotland, she put something out on the internet a couple of months ago saying that the smacking ban wasn't about telling parents how to bring up their kids, it was about supporting them. So just remember that definition of support. The definition of support is telling parents what to do and threatening them with prison if they don't do it. That's what's called supporting parents. Projects that aim to transform incompetent adults into skilled parents tend to disempower mothers and fathers and empower professionals. Just the very idea that there is such a thing as a parenting expert, a parenting professional, who obviously knows far more about it and has read far more books about it than actual parents, even the awareness, even the honouring of those people in a culture undermines parents, because it gives parents just that sense of uncertainty and ignorance about the task that they're engaged in, entirely unjustified in almost all cases. Most professional groups promote their own interests, and the parenting and child protection industry is no exception. Constantly drawing attention to alleged problems and then presenting themselves as the solution to them. In the past, professional intervention in family life was focused on problem families. Such intervention was targeted towards specific people who were deemed to be unfit or exceptionally ignorant parents. This relatively modest role has given way to a far more ambitious project designed to support, remember that word, designed to support all parents. Well, what could he have been writing about here? This was written maybe going on 20 years ago, but that could just be a criticism of the named person scheme, couldn't it? I know the named person scheme's on the back burner at the moment, but the philosophy behind it is alive and well in the Scottish government. The role of parent changes if authority shifts to the professional. The parent now has to listen and defer to outside opinion. To ignore such expertise is to court public mistrust and the accusation of irresponsibility. The literature on child rearing is surprisingly silent on the potential problems caused by the sharing of parental authority. Now, so I mean that no one's going to be bothering doing that research because it doesn't suit their professional agenda. However, once authority for parenting is accorded to a group of professionals, the legitimacy accorded to the status of mothers and fathers is likely to diminish. Parents who are expected to defer to the expert are likely to have a weaker sense of authority than those who do not. It's not possible to share some of the authority hitherto accorded to the parent without weakening this authority overall. That's true if parents feel that they share authority over their children with professionals to whatever extent, whether it's named person or whether it's just the culture in society, the idea that parents are responsible to do it, to bring up their kids in the way approved of by the experts. No matter which of those it is, that undermines the authority of parents. There is a case for professional support for families, but that support should be unobtrusive and targeted towards the small minority of parents who have genuinely failed to establish their authority over their children. Not distinguishing between the problem faced by the small minority and those confronted by most mothers and fathers is the outcome of the assumption that all normal parents need support. This approach fails both groups of parents. When all parents are treated as potential failures, it's the children who pay the price. Again, sadly, the Scottish government didn't read this book before they came up with the named person scheme. Taking the issue of parenting out of the sphere of political life would make a valuable contribution towards restoring the confidence of many parents. That's quite true. And obviously, we're the Scottish Family Party. A lot of our policies are focused on family and supporting families. And when we say support, we don't mean telling them how to bring up the kids, otherwise we're going to send them to prison. We mean things that will enable them to make their own decisions and to provide for themselves and to bring up their children in the way that they want. And in terms of advice on how to do that, well, there won't be much coming from us, that's for sure.